If your first book is published in your second year at Oxford and it's a biography of Lord Alfred Douglas, it's clear you take a purposeful and possibly oblique view of life. My guest on Belief is the commentator and writer Douglas Murray, whose books, essays and speeches define and refine his views on the political right. The seminal Neoconservatism and Why We Need It was published in 2005. In 2007, he founded the Centre for Social Cohesion, a think tank studying extremism and terrorism in the UK, where he expounded his view that we have much to fear from Islamic extremism. He was its director until 2011. He voted for Cameron in the 2010 election, but soon after became, in his own words, an apostate from the Conservative Party. Douglas Murray is now Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society and writes regularly for, among others, Standpoint, The Spectator and The Wall Street Journal. His most recent book is Islamophilia, A Very Modern Malady. He's still only 34. Well, you've set yourself a political agenda, theoretical politics, quite early on, Douglas. So how did that arise?
Goodness knows, it's always easier to analyse other people's journeys than it is your own. I suppose that I had various opinions, various ideas, and like everybody else, you go out into the world and discover to your amazement that other people don't share them. And some of them I revised, I suppose, as everyone does, and others I've stuck to or amended as needs arose.
So what were the beliefs that you learned from your family?
My father was brought up as a Presbyterian on the Isle of Lewis. And I suppose that I have certainly always had an admiration for a small c conservative form of Christianity, at any rate. And I suppose one of my formative influences was, I remember very distinctly, there was a church that we used to go to locally, which had a choir and in which I learned how to sing and read music and so on, which was, I remember, closed by a vicar who was one of the trendy modern vicar types who immediately brought in a band and renovated the church and painted over all the memorials and all that sort of thing. And I was probably only 6 or 7, but I remember it registering to me as an act of vandalism. And, of course, like everybody else who's suffered that from the Anglican Communion in recent years, of which there's a very large number, you can retreat to places which still keep the traditions alive and well. But
have you done that?
Tried, with intermittent success. I still admire, revere, love a form of Anglican Christianity that I think of as epitomised by the prayer book, the King James Bible, by the great cathedrals, and it's something which I suppose, like everybody else who's been fortunate enough to be brought up in it, remain haunted by.
Now, you went to a Catholic school, St Benedict's, where there was Mass and prayer. Let me just pick out some words from the school's mission statement. Discipline, prayer, responsive obedience, humility, and transformation to full humanity.
Well, I never read it. I never read the mission statement.
Well, tell me about your transformation to full humanity. What was it like growing up there? Was it a school where you felt comfortable?
I don't think, to tell the truth, I don't think it was a terribly formative experience.
Well, it was clearly a very good school because you got a scholarship to Eton.
Yes.
You went on from Eton to Oxford. So you're clearly a high achiever and enjoy doing things well. How were you motivated?
I was very fortunate in going to Eton. Nobody from my family had ever been there, and it was a bit of a surprise to everyone. But it was certainly being catapulted into a world which I'm deeply grateful that I was catapulted into. Because
was it social mobility?
Well, no. I the way I noticed it, I suppose it's affected a lot of my views on education since. I mean, before going to St Benedict's, I'd been to a pretty rough inner-city state school in London. I saw what failure of a school was like, and I would argue failure of a society. And having, by the time I got to Eton, seen pretty much the gamut, I think, the run of education, people sometimes say to me, what are the differences you notice? And if there was one I could put my finger on, it is that Eton was extraordinary in encouraging its pupils to be good at whatever it was they did. And I suppose I just wish, looking back on it, that more schools are more ambitious to persuade their pupils that there aren't things holding you back.
How did that freedom of choice operate in that you have obviously exercised particular decisions quite early in your life. One, to be a writer. You were writing a book before you went to Oxford. You were obviously interested in political agenda. How did that arise within your mind?
Politics has not really ever been particularly the thing that drives me. I feel like I'm driven and interested by culture. And I suppose that at a certain point I realised that these two things, culture and politics, were deeply interwoven. But I don't particularly care. I've never been interested in, poring over Hansard and working out which by-election is of particular note. That's not what drives me or ever has. I care about the culture which I love and part of the culture which I come from, and believe that that is interwoven with politics, albeit not always for the better.
And what cultural directions did you inherit from your family? What kind of home was it? Music, creative?
Music, yes, a bit of that, but I suppose mainly if I look at it, probably just a willingness to discuss and exchange ideas. Neither of my parents are involved in anything like I'm involved in. My mother's a teacher, my father a civil servant. But they encouraged my brother and I to discuss and to debate things. The family meal times were a real meal around a table, in which usually my brother and I would enrage each other, and sometimes he'd be a Republican and I'd be a monarchist, or the other way around, or whatever. But you got an opportunity to discuss things. And I think that is very valuable and something I would urge everyone to do, to have the opportunity to really understand that debate and discussion is about principles, but it is also just a good discipline.
When did you become concerned about the way things are? Because in a way, all your writing and all your attitude, albeit not party political, is concerned with dissatisfactions at the way things are.
Yes, I suppose I'm a dissatisfied person in that regard. I left Oxford in the summer of 2001, just as the world was becoming interesting again. And quite swiftly, I think my generation moved in particular directions. There were people I was very close to who I realised took completely opposite views to me about what was already happening in the world and obviously what happened after 9/11. And I suppose there was a lot of falling out. It was a good period for falling out with people, but that always means that you refine your own views as well. I suppose I became concerned most when I saw what I would regard as being the giving in to a certain form of chaos, really. I think it was Jean Kirkpatrick who said during the Vietnam protests, that there were many reasons to be critical of American policy, and nobody thought that America was perfect, but America, in order to be better, had to survive. And one of the underlying strains that concerned me very much in the post-9/11 period was the people who weren't simply criticising the society from which I came, but seemed to be forming an alliance with people who actively wanted to destroy it.
Can you enumerate?
The way in which, for instance, there was a willingness for people to say that America had brought it upon herself, that London had brought it upon itself, that this was somehow our fault, that terrorism was caused by us. I saw it in a much more, I suppose, visceral feeling when in 2002 Dutch politician Pim Fortuyn was assassinated, and then 2004 the filmmaking colleague of a friend of mine, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her colleague Theo van Gogh, was assassinated in Amsterdam. And I remember that the feeling then that I had was also, why are people saying he brought it on himself? Why are they saying he was provocative? He was a filmmaker. He made films. In that particular case, he highlighted the plight of some women within Islam. And he was killed. And instead of rising up in rage that this could be even excused by anybody, there was this element of, well, perhaps one oughtn't to be too outspoken.
Well, you're defining your view as it were, opposed to these opinions you've mentioned. But let's look at your own positive creed, neoconservatism and why we need it. Can you elucidate the particular phrase?
To me, there were a group of people in America, Irving Kristol, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others, who epitomised a form of small c conservatism that met liberalism, real liberalism, in a way which appealed to me and appeals to me still. It was, I suppose, most noticeable by people who thought that, for instance, Western democracies, societies like ours, free societies, shouldn't simply sit back on their achievements and accomplishments, but should try to encourage other countries, particularly countries that suffer dictatorships, to move in a similar direction. That obviously, after 2003 in Iraq, that took quite a knock, because I think a lot of people, myself included, saw that it wasn't as easy as perhaps sometimes we said.
But you felt that the Iraq War was liberal intervention for the sake of spreading democracy?
Yes, and I mean, around that time I was already meeting members of the oppositions of other countries in the region who were trying to bring their countries into a position which we would recognise as a normal society. It's always been my belief that what we call Western values are universal values, or at least values that everyone should have the right to access. I don't think that free speech is a purely Western right. Domestically, it's all a bit more up for grabs.
So are we talking free markets, freedmen?
Free markets, but I mean, of course, the phrase I always like is Irving Kristol's 2 cheers for capitalism, only because you can't give it the third, or it'll become flattered and behave badly. The free market is a good thing, but is not in itself virtuous or noble. It isn't an ideology, it's simply a thing.
Does it need regulating?
Yeah, it needs regulating. It needs also the exercise of personal decency. I think the more you look at economics in particular, but the more you look at a lot of politics, the more you realise that there are certain functional things that can be done, certain bits of red tape that can be tidied up or cut away, but that doesn't make a society good.
Where does personal decency come from?
I would say that it comes from all sorts of directions. One is undoubtedly shame. I can't help thinking that a lot that has gone wrong in recent years in banking and elsewhere has come about by people's peers either not minding how they behave or actually thinking that bad behaviour in itself doesn't matter or is the norm. And as I say, this is why I think that on a whole range of things, it isn't about politics, it's about culture, it's about, apart from anything else, of course, religion. And I think that a lot of non-believers, a lot of atheists and secularists do underplay the significance that religion has in people's lives.
So do you think that the decline of religion has led to some sort of moral collapse?
Well, you know, people are very, very unwilling to I think, consider this. But and I always think of those lines of T.S. Eliot from the Choruses from the Rock. He said, "Do you need to be told that even such modest attainments as you have made in the way of polite society will hardly survive the faith to which they owed their significance?" Now, today, we tend to, I think, in Western countries, particularly in Europe, think that we've got to where we got to by something like gravity, that it was inevitable and that all societies could inevitably fall in the same direction. And I think that isn't true. I think that things which you do see rolling away at the moment, I think a concept, apart from anything else, of human life itself having a sanctity. Now, I would like to think that even secularists and atheists and non-believers, we can agree that the human being must have a certain sanctity about him and herself. But it's quite hard, actually, to sustain some of that if you entirely drop religion. And I think there are all sorts of things we see around us that we thought would survive even when we cut this branch off from the tree that gave it birth.
You speak of secularists and atheists, and yet you yourself are not particularly devout.
No.
So are you one of them?
I find myself in a curious position on this one, which I thought we would come to. It makes me nervous. I was a devout believer, I suppose, for most of my life, and then wrote a piece in The Spectator some years ago coming out as an atheist.
You went further. You said Mohammed made me an atheist.
I said Mohammed made me an atheist, which I remember made my editors nervous. If you spend quite a lot of time looking at another belief system and see how it works, how it came about, how it was invented, and so on, it's likely that you will end up applying that to your own beliefs as well and think, well, maybe this was constructed too. And that was a process I went through. And like a lot of people who lose their faith, it was very painful and disorientating, I suppose, for a while. And at the same time, liberating. Because I think the first thing that happens is a sort of sense of relief and freedom. And it's only been in recent years I've started to undo some of that, because some of the sense of that freedom, I think, is something I question now. If you recognise that your society's achievements come from a certain religious source, what do you do? Do you keep the source going? Do you try to remoor to the bank, or do you rely on other people to do the believing? I mean, I think a lot of people ask themselves that question. Somebody has to believe if you believe that. And so
Is that what you're doing?
No. I'd call myself an Anglican agnostic, because some people would just call it an Anglican. But I think there's a huge amount to be said for a form of liberal religion which gives people a purpose and a story, really, in their lives. And this is one of the things that I think of now, and one of the things that I suppose allows me to attend church without feeling like I'm fibbing someone. I believe in the story of Christianity, and I think it's the story which we come from. And
You believe in the virgin birth?
No.
Resurrection from the dead?
No.
Life everlasting?
No, I think that they're all possible. I'm willing to be convinced, but can't believe it. I can believe in it as something more than metaphor, though. I'm not sure that religion works if it's only metaphor, but I think there is something that is more than metaphor in what I'm saying. I think something can be both true and not true. You can say it is just a story or just a metaphor, but it isn't. It's something more than that. And there are elements of that story which I would still maintain describe us better than the secular atheist worldview can currently describe us.
Now, is that true of other religions too? When you say that truth is more than a metaphor, is that true of other religions? Is it true of Islam?
Well, it's hard to say with Islam because it's a religion that came out of, and I think was invented in the wake of Christianity and Judaism. Muhammad obviously heard some of the stories and drew from the same sources, the same well of ideas.
The religions of the book.
Yes, I mean, he'd heard stories of Jesus that had not been written down, but were being transmitted orally. I think
But you have a problem with Islam.
Yes, I do. Well, that's because I think that there's a political system within Islam which is troubling. Religion has to be separated from politics as an implementary tool.
Church and state.
Yes,
completely separate.
it has to be separate. Of course, it influences. As I said earlier, it's bound to have some influence. But
well, Anglican Church is the established church of the country.
Yes, it is, and then that is a historical anomaly in a way, which is strange. But if the Anglican Church were able to dictate law according to its scriptures, I would have a problem with that, and do have a problem with that. And I don't think that the church, other than as a ceremonial attachment, should have the capability to dictate law along those lines. Thankfully, today, the Anglican Church doesn't do that. But across large numbers of countries in the world today, Islam does do that. And as long as Islam is a system of law as well as a system of belief, I have a problem with it, and I think everybody should.
So you're not just opposed to extremist terrorist groups within Islam, you're worried about the entire thesis of Sharia law as underpinning the theology.
Yes, I mean, obviously I'm most concerned by extremists who blow
obviously.
stuff up. But obviously they don't come from nowhere. And one of the things that gives them succor is the fact that there is this difficulty that is still going on, and may, I think, take many decades, if not centuries, to still unravel, of trying to disassociate the law from the religion. I know plenty of Muslims, by the way, who are trying to make the sort of divorce I was describing myself as living in their own religion. And some manage it, but it is extremely difficult for them because it is very, very easy in Islam to declare somebody as being effectively an apostate out of the Ummah, and there are consequences for that.
You don't think that that's a recent political development as a result of post-colonial society? Because if you take somewhere like Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim state, it has this complete balance and peaceable intent.
Some of it, yes. I would like it not to be the brittle thing that it is, and I'd like those very many people who cherish the culture they come from but want to escape from the mullahs. I want them to have a chance, and I think they have a very bad chance at the moment.
You created the Centre for Social Cohesion. What was the purpose of that?
Well, that was really to try to highlight some of these things and to open up some of that debate. We're quite bad as a society at discussing it, and I think that made us bad at discussing Islam, bad at discussing Islamic fundamentalism. And I suppose one of the aims was to try to open up that discussion a bit more. And I think that has happened.
You think that succeeded?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are things that I can say now and that friends and colleagues, Muslim and non-Muslim, can say now, which 4 or 5 years ago would have got us into terrible trouble.
Well, it did get you into trouble, didn't it?
Yes.
You tried to speak at debates. You were told by the police that you needed protection.
Yes.
Did that shake your beliefs, or did it simply make you more determined to express them?
Well, whenever somebody says they want to kill me for what I say, I only have 2 choices. One is to shut up and retire to a Scottish island, and the other is to keep speaking. And so I keep speaking.
You're cradled in the comfort of Western democracy with the police force and benign tolerance on every part. Does that, in fact, not suggest that if you might temper your own expression and belong perhaps more to the mainstream of being tolerant of a community which lives within your society, because you're quite heavy on immigration, for example. You don't want people coming here.
Well, you can't, for instance, import millions of people with very different belief systems from those of your society and not expect it to have some impact. And again, we may expect that everyone will behave as tolerant cultural Anglicans, but they may think otherwise. And I suppose of the many tensions that now exist within our society, one of them, and a not inconsiderable one, is that which comes from a sort of benign, contented, soft, liberal, nice way of living, and what it does when it meets fanaticism.
But wait a minute, immigrants aren't fanatics by
No,
definition.
No,
but
of course not.
do
Of course
you
not.
welcome-
But, for instance, a large proportion of people from certain countries more than others, let's face it, will have extremely extremist views, and you will have to do something about that. I would argue that you would be better at integration than we have been, but at this stage, I mean, now people aren't surprised, they aren't shocked, and indeed we're able to discuss the tens of thousands of young women in Britain who have been genitally mutilated. For some years, that was a cultural issue. I was told that for a long time myself. This was a cultural issue. But there are, I think, certain places where you have to draw your lines. And I think that very few people now wouldn't think that if we'd just gone a bit easier on the speed of immigration during the late 90s and early 2000s, stressed a little bit more what our values were, that we wouldn't be in a better place now.
But you're against multiculturalism then. You don't want different communities being offered the tolerance that the host community
I do.
enjoys.
I want them to be offered all the tolerance possible as long as they fit in with our particular way of life. I don't want them to be so tolerant that they're allowed to do things like FGM, honour killing and so on. Of course not.
Well, these things are against the law.
They are, but again, it is striking how few of these things were pursued. The police admit now there were many, many cases of young women who went missing, who were killed, who they didn't investigate about because or who went missing because the police said this was a cultural issue. We have been insane, really, in this country about this, and I simply think that there is a balancing now that is going on of people realising that. But we have to address the issues. We have to address the type of culture we have.
Have we turned the corner?
No, I think we may be getting near seeing a corner, but it is striking that there are, as I said, there is a debate is wider now than it has been for some years. And we should ask ourselves the fundamental questions. What type of a country do we want to be? And most importantly, can it be limitlessly tolerant? I would simply, as I say, like to see it made more clear that this society has a particular history, a particular set of values which, if you like it or not, we have developed. This country has been open to people who want to be part of that and must remain open to people who want to be part of that, but cannot be open to those who would wish to end it.
So who do you want to welcome here? And to what extent will you extend the Christian welcome of the Christianity of the host country to the stranger?
Well, people used to become part of a society because they liked the things that they could get if they were here, and they liked the country they integrated into. I mean, I would simply comment on the integration issue, that what we see is a reverse integration at the moment. I was speaking at a mosque in East London the other day about the niqab, and all of the audience were covered in a full face covering. And I stayed around for some time afterwards speaking to the women, and they were mostly people whose parents and grandparents had come to this country. And I would simply think it can't be stated enough. Their parents and grandparents came to this country to escape this. And then we see this weird reverse integration where their grandchildren put it on.
Who would you keep out? And how?
Well, I mean, it's not easy, is it? We know this. It's not easy. I think that you can't have immigration at the speed we've had it in recent years and retain a cohesive society. You simply can't.
No, but that's a criticism. But what I'm saying is, who would you keep out?
Well, asylum seems to me to be one of the most important things that a decent, civilised society can give. I think it's at risk when you have huge amounts of economic migration at the same time, because the public, apart from anything else, mix these two things up. I think that we should remain somewhere where people can come when they're fleeing totalitarianism. I think we should also encourage them, by the way, after those regimes fall, to take part in the rebuilding of their own countries. That's something we haven't encouraged at all, and it's very strange because it means, apart from anything else, there's a sort of brain drain from certain countries.
But they often want to go home if the country has changed.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think there's nothing wrong with encouraging that.
But not insisting.
I'd be careful on insisting.
Tell me about the Henry Jackson Society. Who was he?
He was a Democrat, and he was part of a tradition in America, which I think sadly is going there, and which may be going here, of people who realise that there are some issues that are way beyond party politics.
So you're suspicious of the political classes, quasi-political classes?
Yes, deeply. I understand that you have to collect views broadly around some kind of consensus, but the way in which our political structure is set up to basically quash outside opinion, and within its own structures to stop people speaking freely. Because after all, we always complain that everyone is too monotone in our politics, and then whenever anyone says anything else, they're said to have created a gaffe. I want more gaffes.
Matthew Paris has written of you, Douglas Murray writes so well that when he's wrong, it's dangerous. How often do you confess to being wrong, Douglas?
Well, I like to think I can, and I do. I have admitted I've been wrong on a number of occasions.
Such as?
There are, for instance, actually, when I reversed my feelings on religion, I admitted some things I'd been wrong about, and I think I've reversed some of that, although it doesn't mean I've gone back to the place I started necessarily. But I like to think as well, if I get a fact wrong or say something wrong, that I can say so.
I've remarked on your youth, Douglas. I hope you'll excuse that. But it does mean that you've got a life ahead of you. So what do you think you will live to see? What prospects do you see in the decades ahead for yourself and for society?
I hope that some of the things I say and have said in recent years continue to become a bit more mainstream. I'm sure that other issues will open up. I suppose what I do care about is conserving the things that are valuable and good in our culture. And I think one of the things when I look forward is that there will probably be a further pulling apart of sections of our society. I can't help thinking, I notice it the more I look around now, that the period of thinking that there was going to be a great melting pot has not really happened. It didn't happen in America, actually, although integration occurs. What I do think is that there will be some kind of restatement of ourselves and our values and our heritage, which will allow people once more, instead of thinking of it as somehow crass or naff or indeed stupid or bigoted, to talk about your cherishing of the culture which you come from, may realise that this is actually a decent position and a perfectly viable position. I do worry about it, everybody does, that restating of your values and your culture may go in the wrong direction. I see that happening in certain European countries at the moment. I've seen it several times, actually. I simply think that there is an opportunity to do that restating in an open, liberal-minded, tolerant way, which is, as I say, tolerant of difference, but not infinitely so, and something which is grateful rather than proud.
Douglas Murray, thank you.